everyone, and welcome back to the Reading Corner. I'm your host, Renee, and I am here for you every Wednesday reading stories from the public domain. And today we're starting with a new book, so yay! Written in 1951, The Daughter of Time by Josephine Tay. Without further ado, let's get into it. Chapter 1. Grant lay on his high white cot and stared at the ceiling. Stared at it with loathing. He knew by heart every last minute crack on its nice clean surface. He had made maps of the ceiling and gone exploring on them. Rivers, islands, and continents. He had made guessing games of it and discovered hidden objects, faces, birds, and fishes. He had made mathematical calculations of it and rediscovered his childhood, theorems, angles, and triangles. There was practically nothing else he could do but look at it. He hated the sight of it. He had suggested to the midget that she might turn his bed round a little so that he could have a new patch of ceiling to explore. But it seemed that that would spoil the symmetry of the room, and in hospitals, symmetry ranked just a short head behind cleanliness and a whole length in front of godliness. Anything out of the parallel was hospital profanity. Why didn't he read? She asked. Why didn't he go on reading some of those expensive brand new novels that his friends kept on bringing him? There are far too many people born into the world, and far too many words written. Millions and millions of them pouring from the presses every minute. It's a horrible thought. You sound constipated, said the midget. The midget was Nurse Ingham, and she was in sober fact a very nice 5 feet 2, with everything in just proportion. Grant called her the midget to compensate himself for being bossed around by a piece of Dresden china which he could pick up in one hand. When he was on his feet, that is to say. It was not only that she told him what he might or might not do, but she dealt with his 6 feet odd with an offhand ease that Grant found humiliating. Weights meant nothing, apparently, to the midget. She tossed mattresses around with the absent-minded grace of a plate spinner. When she was off duty, he was attended to by the Amazon, a goddess with arms like the limb of a beech tree. The Amazon was Nurse Darrell, who came from Gloucestershire and was homesick each daffodil season. The midget came from Lytham St. Anne's, and there was no daffodil nonsense about her. She had large soft hands and large soft cow's eyes, and she always looked very sorry for you, but the slightest physical exertion set her breathing like a suction pump. On the whole, Grant found it even more humiliating to be treated as a dead weight than to be treated as if he was no weight at all. Grant was bedborne, and a charge on the midget and the Amazon, because he had fallen through a trap door. This, of course, was the absolute in humiliation, compared with which the heavings of the Amazon and the light slingings of the midget were a mere corollary. To fall through a trap door was the ultimate in absurdity, pantomimic, Bathic, grotesque. At the moment of his disappearance from the normal level of preambulation, he had been in hot pursuit of Benny Skoll, and the fact that Benny had careered around the next corner slap into the arms of Sergeant Williams provided the one small crumb of comfort in an intolerable situation. Benny was now away for 3 years, which was very satisfactory for the lieges, but Benny would get time off for good behavior. In hospitals, there was no time off for good behavior. Grant stopped staring at the ceiling and slid his eyes sideways at the pile of books on his bedside table, the gay, expensive pile that the midget had been urging on his attention. The top one, with the pretty picture of Valletta in unlikely pink, was Lavinia Fitch's annual account of a blameless heroine's tribulations. In view of the representation of the Grand Harbor on the cover, the present Valerie or Angela or Cecile or Denise must be a naval wife. He had opened the book only to read the kind message that Lavinia had written inside. The Sweat and the Furrow was Silas Weekly being earthy and spade-conscious all over 700 pages. The situation, to judge from the first paragraph, had not materially changed since Silas's last book. Mother lying in with her 11th upstairs, father laid out after his 9th downstairs, eldest son lying to the government in the cowshed, eldest daughter lying with her lover in the hayloft, everyone else lying low in the barn. The rain dripped from the thatch, and the manure steamed in the midden. Silas never omitted the manure. It was not Silas's fault that its steam provided the only uprising element in the picture. If Silas could have discovered a brand of steam that steamed downward, Silas would have introduced it. Under the harsh shadows and highlights of Silas's jacket was an elegant affair of Edwardian curlicues and Baroque nonsense, entitled Bells on Her Toes, which was Rupert Rouge being arch about vice. Rupert Rouge always seduced you into laughter for the first 3 pages. About page 3, you noticed that Rupert had learned from the very arch, but of course not vicious, creature, George Bernard Shaw, that the easiest way to sound witty was to use that cheap and convenient method, the paradox. After that, you could see the jokes coming 3 sentences away. The Thing with a Red Gun Flash across a night green cover was Oscar Oakley's latest. Toughs talking out of the corners of their mouths in synthetic American that had neither the wit nor the pungency of the real thing. Blondes, chromium bars, breakneck chases, very remarkable bunk. The Case of the Missing Tin Opener by John James Mark had 3 errors of procedure in the first 2 pages and had at least provided Grant with a pleasant 5 minutes while he composed an imaginary letter to its author. He could not remember what the thin blue book at the bottom of the pile was. Something earnest and statistical, he thought. Test flies or calories or sex behavior or something. Even in that, you knew what to expect on the next page. Did no one any more, no one in all this wide world, change their record now and then? Was everyone nowadays thrilled to a formula? Authors today wrote so much to a pattern that their public expected it. The public talked about a new Silas Weekly or a new Lavinia Finch, exactly as they talked about a new brick or a new hairbrush. They never said, a new book by, whoever it might be. Their interest was not in the book, but in its newness. They knew quite well what the book would be like. It might be a good thing, Grant thought, as he turned his nauseated gaze away from the motley pile. If all the presses of the world were stopped for a generation, there ought to be a literary moratorium. Some Superman ought to invent a ray that would stop them all simultaneously. Then people wouldn't send you a lot of fool nonsense when you were flat on your back, and bossy bits of Messian wouldn't expect you to read them. He heard the door open, but did not stir himself to look. He had turned his face to the wall, literally and metaphorically. He heard someone come across to his bed and closed his eyes against possible conversation. He wanted neither Gloucestershire sympathy or Lancashire briskness just now. In the succeeding pause, a faint enticement, a nostalgic breath of all the fields of grass, teased his nostrils and swam about his brain. He savored it and considered. The midget smelt of lavender dusting powder and the Amazon of soap and idioform. What was floating expensively about his nostrils was l'enclos numéro 5. Only one person of his acquaintance used l'enclos number 5, Martha Hallard. He opened an eye and squinted up at her. She had evidently bent over to see if he was asleep, and was now standing in an irresolute way, if anything Martha did could be said to be irresolute, with her attention on the heap of all too obviously virgin publications on the table. In one arm she was carrying 2 new books, and in the other a great sheaf of white lilac. He wondered whether she had chosen white lilac because it was her idea of the proper floral offering for winter. It adorned her dressing room at the theatre from December to March, or whether she had taken it because it would not detract from her black and white chic. She was wearing a new hat and her usual pearls, the pearls which he had once been the means of recovering for her. She looked very handsome, very Parisian, and blessedly unhospital-like. "Did I waken you, Allan?" "No, I wasn't asleep." "I seem to be bringing the proverbial coals," she said, dropping the 2 books alongside their despised brethren. "I hope you will find these more interesting than you seem to have found that lot. Didn't you even try a little teensy taste of our Lavinia?" "I can't read anything." "Are you in pain?" "Agony, but it's neither my leg nor my back." "What then?" "It's what my cousin Laura calls the prickles of boredom." "Poor Allan, and how right your Laura is!" She picked a bunch of narcissi out of the glass that was much too large for them, propped them with one of her best gestures into the wash basin, and then proceeded to substitute the lilac. "One would expect boredom to be a great yawning emotion, but it isn't, of course. It's a small, niggling thing." "Small nothing. Niggling nothing. It's like being beaten with nettles." "Why don't you take up something?" "Improve the shining hour." "Improve your mind, to say nothing of your soul and your temper. You might study one of the philosophies, yoga, or something like that. But I suppose an analytical mind is not the best kind of thing to bring to the consideration of the abstract." "I did think of going back to algebra. I have an idea that I never did algebra justice at school, but I've done so much geometry on that damned ceiling that I'm a little off mathematics." "Well, I suppose it is no use suggesting jigsaws to someone in your position. How about crosswords? I could get you a book of them if you like."
"God forbid."
"You could invent them, of course. I have heard that that is more fun than solving them."
"Perhaps, but a dictionary weighs several pounds. Besides, I always did hate looking up something in a reference book."
"Do you play chess?" "I don't remember. How about chess problems? White to play and mate, in 3 moves, or something like that."
"My only interest in chess is pictorial."
"Pictorial?"
"Very decorative things, knights and pawns and whatnot. Very elegant."
"Charming. I could bring you along a set to play with." "All right, no chess. You could do some academic investigating. That's a sort of mathematics, finding a solution to an unsolved problem."
"Crime, you mean? I know all the case histories by heart, and there is nothing more that can be done about any of them. Certainly not by someone who is flat on his back."
"I didn't mean something out of the files at the Yard. I meant something more, what's the word? Something classic. Something that has puzzled the world for ages."
"As what, for instance?"
"Say, the casket letters."
"Oh, not Mary, Queen of Scots."
"Why not?"
asked Marta, who, like all actresses, saw Mary Stuart through a haze of white veils. "I could be interested in a bad woman, but never in a silly one."
"Silly?"
said Marta, in her best lower register Electra voice. "Very silly."
"Oh, Allan, how can you?"
"If she had worn another kind of headdress, no one would ever have bothered about her. It's the cap that seduces people."
"You think she would have loved less greatly in a sunbonnet?"
"She never loved greatly at all, in any kind of bonnet." Marta looked as scandalized as a lifetime in the theater and an hour of careful make-up allowed her to.
"Why do you think that?"
"Mary Stuart was 6 feet tall. Nearly all outsized women are cold. Ask any doctor." And as he said it, he wondered why, in all the years since Marta had first adopted him as a spare escort when she needed one, it had not occurred to him to wonder whether her notorious level-headedness about men had something to do with her inches. But Marta had not drawn any parallels. Her mind was still on her favorite queen.
"Well, at least she was a martyr. You'll have to allow her that."
"A martyr to what?"
"Her religion."
"The only thing she was a martyr to was rheumatism. She married Darnley without the Pope's dispensation, and Bothwell by Protestant rites."
"In a moment you'll be telling me she wasn't a prisoner."
The trouble with you is that you think of her in a little room at the top of a castle, with bars on the window and a faithful old attendant to share her prayers with her. In actual fact, she had a personal household of 60 persons. She complained bitterly when it was reduced to a beggarly 30, and nearly died of chagrin when it was reduced to 2 male secretaries, several women, an embroiderer, and a cook or 2. And Elizabeth had to pay for all that out of her own purse. For 20 years she paid, and for 20 years Mary Stuart hawked the crown of Scotland round Europe to anyone who would start a revolution and put her back on the throne that she had lost, or, alternatively, on the one Elizabeth was sitting on. He looked at Martha and found that she was smiling. "Are they a little better now?" she asked. "Are what better?" "The prickles." He laughed. "Yes. For a whole minute I had forgotten about them. That is at least one good thing to be put down to Mary Stuart's account." "How do you know so much about Mary?" "I did an essay about her in my last year at school." "And didn't like her, I take it?" "Didn't like what I found out about her." "You don't think her tragic, then?" "Oh, yes, very. But not tragic in any of the ways that popular beliefs make her tragic. Her tragedy was that she was born a queen, with the outlook of a suburban housewife. Scoring off Mrs. Tudor in the next street was harmless and amusing. It may lead you into unwarrantable indulgence in higher purchases, but it affects only yourself. When you use the same technique on kingdoms, the result is disastrous. If you are willing to put a country of 10 million people in pawn in order to score off a royal rival, then you end up being a friendless failure." He lay thinking about it for a little. She would have been a wild success as a mistress at a girls' school. "Beast!" "I meant it nicely. The staff would have liked her, and all the little girls would have adored her. That is what I meant about her being tragic." "Ah, well, no casket letters, it seems. What else is there? The man in the iron mask?" "I can't remember who that was, but I couldn't be interested in anyone who was being coy behind some tin plate. I couldn't be interested in anyone at all unless I could see his face." "Ah, yes, I forgot your passion for faces. The Borgias have wonderful faces. I should think they would provide a little mystery or two for you to dabble in if you looked them up. Or there was Perkin Warbeck, of course. Imposture is always fascinating. Was he or wasn't he? A lovely game. The balance can never come down wholly on one side or the other. You push it over and up it comes again, like one of those weighted toys." The door opened, and Mrs. Tinker's homely face appeared in that aperture surmounted by her still more homely and historic hat. Mrs. Tinker had worn the same hat since first she began to "do" for Grant, and he could not imagine her in any other. That she did possess another one, he knew, because it went with something that she referred to as "me blue." Her blue was an occasional affair in both senses, and never appeared at 19 Tenby Court. It was worn with a ritualistic awareness, and having been worn, it was used in the event as a yardstick by which to judge the proceedings. Did you enjoy it, Tink? What was it like? Not worth putting on me blue for? She had worn it to Princess Elizabeth's wedding, and to various other royal functions, and had indeed figured in it for 2 flashing seconds in a newsreel shot of the Duchess of Kent cutting a ribbon. But to Grant it was a mere report, a criterion of the social worth of an occasion. A thing was or was not worth putting on "me blue" for. "I heard you had a visitor," said Mrs. Tinker, "and I was all set to go away again when I thought the voice sounded familiar like, and I says to myself, it's only Miss Hallard. I says, so I comes in." She was carrying various paper bags and a small tight bunch of anemones. She greeted Martha as woman to woman, having been in her time a dresser, and having therefore no exaggerated reverence for the goddess of the theatre world, and looked askance at the beautiful arrangement of lilac sprays that had blossomed under Martha's ministrations. Martha did not see the glance, but she saw the little bunch of anemones and took over the situation as if it were something already rehearsed. "I squander my vagabond's hire on white lilac for you, and then Mrs. Tinker puts my nose out of joint by bringing you the lilies of the field." "Lilies?" said Mrs. Tinker doubtfully.
Those are the Solomon in all his glory things, the ones that toiled not neither did they spin.
Mrs. Tinker went to church only for weddings and christenings, but she belonged to a generation that had been sent to Sunday school. She looked with a new interest at the little handful of glory encased by her woolen glove.
Well now, I never knew that. Makes more sense that way, don't it? I always pictured them orums, fields and fields of orums. Awful expensive, you know, but a bit depressing. So they was coloured. Well, why can't they say so? What do they have to call them lilies for?
And they went on to talk about translation and how misleading Holy Writ could be.
I always wondered what bread on the waters was,
Mrs. Tinker said, and the awkward moment was over. While they were still busy with the Bible, the midget came in with extra flower vases. Grant noticed that the vases were designed to hold white lilac and not anemones. They were tribute to Martha, a passport for further communing. But Martha never bothered about women unless she had an immediate use for them. Her tact with Mrs. Tinker had been mere savoir-faire, a conditioned reflex. So the midget was reduced to being functional instead of social. She collected the discarded narcissi from the wash basin and meekly put them back into a vase. The midget, being meek, was the most beautiful sight that had gladdened Grant's eyes for a long time.
Well,
Martha said, having finished her arrangement of the lilac and placed the result where he could see it.
I shall leave Mrs. Tinker to feed you all the tidbits out of those paper bags. It couldn't be, could it, Mrs. Tinker, darling, that one of those bags contains any of your wonderful bachelor's buttons?
Mrs. Tinker glowed. You'd like one or two, maybe, fresh out of me oven?
Well, of course. I shall have to do penance for it afterwards. Those little rich cakes are death on the waist. But just give me a couple to put in my bag for my tea at the theatre.
She chose two with a flattering deliberation.
I like them a little brown at the edges.
Dropped them into her handbag and said,
Well, au revoir, Allan. I shall look in a day or two and start you on a sock. There is nothing so soothing, I understand, as knitting. Isn't that so, nurse?
Oh, yes.
Yes, indeed. A lot of my gentlemen patients take to knitting. They find it whiles away the time very nicely.
Martha blew him a kiss from the door and was gone, followed by the respectful midget.
I'd be surprised if that hussy is any better than she ought to be,
Mrs. Tinker said, beginning to open the paper bags. She was not referring to Martha. Chapter 2. But when Martha came back 2 days later, it was not with knitting needles and wool. She breezed in, very dashing, in a Cossack hat worn at a casual rake that must have taken her several minutes at her mirror just after lunch.
I haven't come to stay, my dear. I'm on my way to the theatre. It's matinee day, God help me, tea trays and morons, and we've all got to the frightful stage when the lines have ceased to have any meaning at all for us. I don't think this play is ever coming off. It's going to be like those New York ones that run by the decade instead of by the year. It's too frightening. One's mind just won't stay on the thing. Joffrey dried up in the middle of the second act last night. His eyes nearly popped out of his head. I thought for a moment he was having a stroke. He said afterwards that he had no recollection of anything that happened between his entrance and the point where he came to, and found himself halfway through the act.
A blackout, you mean?
No, oh no, just being on automation, saying the lines and doing the business and thinking of something else all the time.
If all reports are true, that's no unusual matter where actors are concerned.
Oh, in moderation, no. Johnny Garson can tell you how much paper there is in the house what time he is sobbing his heart out of someone's lap. But that's different from being away for half an act. Do you realize that Joffrey had turned his son out of the house, quarrelled with his mistress, and accused his wife of having an affair with his best friend, all without being aware of it?
What was he aware of?
He says he has decided to lease his Park Lane Fiat to Dolly Dacre and buy that Charles II house at Richmond that the Latimers are giving up because he has got that governor's appointment. He had thought about the lack of bathrooms and decided that the little upstairs room with the 18th century Chinese paper would make a very good one. They could remove the beautiful paper and use it to decorate that dull little room downstairs at the back. It's full of Victoria panelling, that dull little room. He had also reviewed the drainage, wondering if he had enough money to take the old tiling off and replace it, and speculated as to what kind of cooking range they had in the kitchen. He had just decided to get rid of the shrubbery at the gate when he found himself face to face with me on a stage in the presence of 987 people in the middle of a speech. Do you wonder that his eyes popped? I see that you have managed to read at least one of the books I brought you, if the rumpled jacket is any criterion.
Yes, the mountain one. It was a godsend. I lay for hours looking at the pictures. Nothing puts things in perspective as quickly as a mountain.
The stars are better, I find.
Oh no. The stars merely reduce one to the status of an amoeba. The stars take the last vestige of human pride, the last spark of confidence from one. But a snow mountain is a nice, human-sized yardstick. I lay and looked at Everest and thanked God that I wasn't climbing those slopes. A hospital bed was a haven of warmth and rest and security by comparison. And the midget and the Amazon, two of the highest achievements of civilization.
Ah, well, here are some more pictures for you.
Marta upended the quarto envelope she was carrying and spilled a collection of paper sheets over his chest. What is this?
Faces,
said Marta delightedly.
Dozens of faces for you, men, women, and children, all sorts, conditions, and sizes.
He picked a sheet off his chest and looked at it. It was an engraving of a 15th century portrait. A woman. Who is this?
Lucretia Borgia. Isn't she a duck?
Perhaps, but are you suggesting that there was any mystery about her?
Oh, yes. No one has ever decided whether she was her brother's tool or his accomplice.
He discarded Lucrezia and picked up the second sheet. This proved to be the portrait of a small boy in late 18th century clothes, and under it, in faint capitals, was printed the words, Louis XVII.
Now there's a beautiful mystery for you, Marta said. The Dauphin. Did he escape or did he die in captivity?
Where did you get all these?
I rooted James out of his cubbyhole at the Victoria and Albert and made him take me to a print shop. I knew he would know about that sort of thing, and I'm sure he has nothing to interest him at the V&A.
It was so like Marta to take it for granted that a civil servant, because he happened also to be a playwright and an authority on portraits, should be willing to leave his work and delve about in print shops for her pleasure. He turned up the photograph of an Elizabethan portrait, a man in velvet and pearls. He turned the back to see who this might be, and found that it was the Earl of Leicester. So that is Elizabeth's Robin, he said. I don't think I ever saw a portrait of him before. Marta looked down on the virile, fleshy face and said,
It occurs to me for the first time that one of the major tragedies of history is that the best painter didn't paint you till you were past your best. Robin must have been quite a man. They say Henry VIII was dazzling as a young man, but what is he now? Something on a playing card. Nowadays we know what Tennyson was like before he grew that frightful beard. Oh, I must fly. I'm late as it is. I've been lunching at the Blage, and so many people came up to talk that I couldn't get away as early as I meant to.
I hope your host was impressed, Grant said, with a glance at the hat.
Oh, yes, she knows about hats. She took one look and said, Jacques tout, I take it.
She? Said Grant, surprised.
Oh, yes, Madeline March. And it was I who was giving her luncheon. Oh, don't look so astonished. It isn't tactful. I'm hoping, if you must know, that she'll write me that play about Lady Blessington. But there was such a toing and a froing that I had no chance to make any impression on her. However, I gave her a wonderful meal, which reminds me that Tony Bitmaker was entertaining a party of 7, magnums galore. How do you imagine he keeps going?
A lack of evidence, Grant said, and she laughed and went away. In the silence, he went back to considering Elizabeth's Robin. What mystery was there about Robin? Oh, yes, Amy Robsart, of course. Well, he wasn't interested in Amy Robsart. He didn't care how she had fallen downstairs, or why.
But he spent a very happy afternoon with the rest of the faces. Long before he had entered the force, he had taken a delight in faces, and in his years at the yard, that interest had proved both a private entertainment and a professional advantage. He had once, in his early days, dropped in with his superintendent at an identification parade. It was not his case, and they were both there on other business, but they lingered in the background and watched while a man and a woman, separately, walked down the line of 12 nondescript men, looking for the one they hoped to recognize. "Which is chummy, do you know?" the super had whispered to him. "I don't know," Grant had said, "but I can guess." "You can? Which do you make it?" "The third from the left." "What is the charge?" "I don't know. I don't know anything about it." His chief had cast him an amused glance, but when both the man and the woman had failed to identify anyone who had gone away, and the line broke into a chattering group, hitching collars and settling ties preparatory to going back to the street and the world of every day from which they had been summoned to assist the law, the one who did not move was the third man from the left. The third man from the left waited submissively for his escort and was led away to his cell again. "Struth," the superintendent had said. "One chance out of 12, and you made it. That was good going. He picked your man out of the bunch," he said in an explanation to the local inspector. "Did you know him?" the inspector said, a little surprised. "He's never been in trouble before, as far as we know." "No, I never saw him before. I don't even know what the charge is." "Then what made you pick him?" Grant had hesitated, analyzing for the first time his process of selection. It had not been a matter of reasoning. He had not said, "That man's face had this characteristic or that characteristic, therefore he is the accused person." His choice had been almost instinctive. The reason was in his subconscious. At last, having delved into his subconscious, he blurted, "He was the only one of the 12 with no lines on his face." They had laughed at that, but Grant, once he had pulled the thing into the light, saw how his instinct had worked and recognized the reasoning behind it. "It sounds silly, but it isn't," he had said. "The only adult entirely without face lines is the idiot." "A Freeman's no idiot, take it from me," the inspector broke in. "A very wide-awake, wide boy he is, believe me." "I didn't mean that. I mean that the idiot is irresponsible. The idiot is the standard of irresponsibility. All those 12 men in the parade were 30-ish, but only one had an irresponsible face, so I picked him at once." After that, it had become a mild joke at the yard that Grant could "pick 'em at sight," and the assistant commissioner had once said teasingly, "Don't tell me that you believe that there's such a thing as a criminal face inspector." But Grant had said no, he wasn't as simple as that. If there was only one kind of crime, sir, it might be possible. But crimes being as wide as human nature, if a policeman started to put faces into categories, he'd be sunk. You can tell what the normal run of disreputable women look like by a walk down Bond Street any day between 5 and 6. And yet the most notorious women in London look like cold saints. "Not so saintly of late. She's drinking too much these days," the AC had said, identifying the lady without difficulty, and the conversation had gone on to other things. But Grant's interest in faces had remained, and enlarged until it became a conscious study, a matter of case records and comparisons. It was, as he had said, not possible to put faces into any kind of category, but it was possible to characterize individual faces. In a reprint of a famous trial, for instance, where photographs of the principal actors in the case were displayed for the public's interest, there was never any doubt as to which was the accused and which the judge. Occasionally, one of the counsel might on looks have changed places with the prisoner in the dock. Counsel were, after all, a mere cross-section of humanity, as liable to passion and greed as the rest of the world. But a judge had a special quality, an integrity and a detachment.
So, even without a wig, one did not confuse him with the man in the dock, who had had neither integrity nor detachment. Marda's James, having been dragged from his cubbyhole, had evidently enjoyed himself, and a fine selection of offenders, or their victims, kept Grant entertained until the midget brought his tea. As he tidied the sheets together to put them away in his locker, his hands came in contact with one that had slipped off his chest and had lain all the afternoon unnoticed on the counterpane. He picked it up and looked at it. It was the portrait of a man dressed in the velvet cap and slashed doublet of the late 15th century. A man about 35 or 36 years old, lean and clean-shaven. He wore a rich jeweled collar and was in the act of putting a ring on the little finger of his right hand. But he was not looking at the ring. He was looking off into space. Of all the portraits Grant had seen this afternoon, this was the most individual. It was as if the artist had striven to put on canvas something that his talent was not sufficient to translate into paint. The expression in the eyes, that most arresting and individual expression, had defeated him. So had the mouth. He had not known how to make lips so thin and so wide look mobile. So the mouth was wooden and a failure. What he had best succeeded in was the bone structure of the face, the strong cheekbones, the hollows below them, the chin too large for strength. Grant paused in the act of turning the thing over, to consider the face a moment longer. A judge? A soldier? A prince? Someone used to great responsibility and responsible in his authority. Someone too conscientious. A worrier. Perhaps a perfectionist. A man at ease in a large design, but anxious over details. A candidate for gastric ulcer. Someone, too, who had suffered ill health as a child. He had that incommunicable, that indescribable look that childhood suffering leaves behind it. Less positive than the look on a cripple's face, but as inescapable. This the artist had both understood and translated into terms of paint. The slight fullness of the lower eyelid, like a child that had slept too heavily. The texture of the skin, the old man look in a young face. He turned the portrait over to look for a caption. On the back was printed, Richard III, from the portrait in the National Portrait Gallery, artist unknown. Richard III. So that was who it was. Richard III, Crouchback, the monster of nursery stories, the destroyer of innocence. A synonym for villainy. He turned the paper over and looked again. Was that what the artist had tried to convey when he had painted those eyes? Had what he had seen in those eyes been the look of a man haunted? He lay a long time looking at that face, at those extraordinary eyes. They were long eyes, set close under the brows. The brows slightly drawn in that worried, over-conscientious frown. At first glance, they appeared to be peering, but as one looked, one found that they were in fact withdrawn, almost absent-minded. When the midget came back for his tray, he was still staring at the portrait. Nothing like this had come his way for years. It made La Gioconda look like a poster. The midget examined his virgin teacup, put a practiced hand against the teapot's tepid cheek, and pouted. She had better things to do, she conveyed, than bring him trays for him to ignore. He pushed the portrait at her. What did she think of it? If that man were her patient, what would be her verdict? Liver, she said crisply, and bore away the tray in heel-tapping protest, all starch and blonde curls. But the surgeon, strolling in against her draught, kindly and casual, had other views. He looked at the portrait, as invited, and said after a moment's interested scrutiny, Poliomyelitis. Infantile paralysis, Grant said, and remembered all of a sudden that Richard III had a withered arm. "Who is it?" the surgeon asked. "Richard III. "Really? That's interesting. Did you know that he had a withered arm?" "Had he? I didn't remember that. I thought he was a hunchback." "So he was." "What I do remember is that he was born with a full set of teeth and ate live frogs." "Well, my diagnosis seems to be abnormally accurate." "Uncanny. What made you choose polio?"
"I don't quite know. Now that you ask me to be definitive. Just the look of the face, I suppose. It's the look one sees on the face of a crippled child. If he was born hunchbacked, that probably accounts for it, and not polio. I notice the artist has left out the hump."
"Yes. Court painters have to have a modicum of tact. It wasn't until Cromwell that sitters asked for warts and all."
"If you ask me,"
the surgeon said absent-mindedly, considering the splint on Grant's leg,
"Cromwell started that inverted snobbery from which we are all suffering today. I'm a plain man, I am. No nonsense about me. And no manners, grace, or generosity either."
He pinched Grant's toe with detached interest.
"It's a raging disease, a horrible perversion. In some parts of the States, I understand, it's as much as a man's political life is worth to go to some constituencies with his tie tied and his coat on. That's being stuffed shirt. The beau ideal is to be one of the boys. That's looking very healthy,"
he added, referring to Grant's big toe, and came back of his own accord to the portrait lying on the counterpane.
"Interesting," he said. "That about the polio. Perhaps it really was polio, and that accounts for the shrunken arm."
He went on considering it, making no movement to go.
"Interesting. Anyhow, portrait of a murderer. Does he run to type, would you say?"
"There isn't a murderer type. People murder for too many different reasons. But I can't remember any murderer, either in my own experience or in case histories, who resembled him."
"Of course, he was au concours in his class, wasn't he? He couldn't have known the meaning of scruple."
"No."
"I once saw Olivia play him. The most dazzling exhibition of sheer evil it was, always on the verge of toppling over into the grotesque, and never doing it."
"When I showed you the portrait," Grant said, "before you knew who it was, did you think of villainy?"
"No,"
said the surgeon.
"No, I thought of illness."
"It's odd, isn't it? I didn't think of villainy either. And now that I know who it is, now that I've read the name on the back, I can't think of it as anything but villainous."
"I suppose villainy, like beauty, is in the eye of the beholder. Well, I'll look in again toward the end of the week. No pain to speak of now?"
And he went away, kindly and casual as he had come. It was only after he had given the portrait further puzzled consideration. It piqued him to have mistaken one of the most notorious murderers of all time for a judge. To have transferred a subject from the dock to the bench was a shocking piece of ineptitude. That it occurred to Grant that the portrait had been provided as the illustration to a piece of detection. What mystery was there about Richard III? And then he remembered. Richard had murdered his 2 boy nephews, but no one knew how. They had disappeared, if he remembered rightly, while Richard was away from London. Richard had sent someone to do the deed, but the mystery of the children's actual fate had never been solved. 2 skeletons had turned up under some stairs in Charles II's day, and had been buried. It was taken for granted that the skeletons were the remains of the young princes, but nothing had ever been proved. It was shocking how little history remained with one after a good education. All he knew about Richard III was that he was the younger brother of Edward IV, that Edward was a blond 6-footer with remarkable good looks and a still more remarkable way with women, and that Richard was a hunchback who usurped the throne on his brother's death in place of the boy heir, and arranged the death of that heir and his small brother to save himself any further trouble. He also knew that Richard had died at the Battle of Bosworth, yelling for a horse, and that he was the last of his line, the last Plantagenet. Every schoolboy turned over the final page of Richard III with relief, because now at last the War of the Roses were over, and they could get on to the Tudors, who were dull but easy to follow. When the midget came to tidy him up for the night, Grant said, "You don't happen to have a history book by any chance, do you?" "A history book? No. What would I be doing with a history book?" It was not a question, so Grant did not try to provide an answer. His silence seemed to fret her. "If you really want a history book," she said presently, "you could ask Nurse Darrell when she brings your supper. She has all her school books on a shelf in her room, and it's quite possible she has a history among them." How like the Amazon to keep her school books, he thought. She was still homesick for school, as she was homesick for Gloucestershire every time the daffodils bloomed. When she lumbered into the room, bearing his cheese pudding and stewed rhubarb, he looked at her with a tolerance that bordered on the benevolent. She ceased to be a large female who breathed like a suction pump and became a potential dispenser of delight. Oh yes, she had a history book, she said. Indeed, she rather thought that she had two. She had kept all her school books because she had loved school. It was on the tip of Grant's tongue to ask her if she had kept her dolls, but he stopped himself in time. "And of course I loved history," she said. "It was my favorite subject. Richard the Lionheart was my hero." "An intolerable bounder," Grant said. "Oh, no," she said, looking wounded. "A hyperthyroid type," Grant said pitilessly, "rocketing to and fro about the earth like a badly made firework. Are you going off duty now?" "Whenever I've finished my trays." "Could you find that book for me tonight?" "You're supposed to be going to sleep, not staying awake over history books." "I might as well read some history as look at the ceiling, which is the alternative. Will you get it for me?" "I don't think I could go all the way up to the nurse's block and back again tonight for someone who is rude about the Lionheart." "All right," he said. "I'm not the stuff that martyrs are made of. As far as I'm concerned, Coeur de Lion is the pattern of chivalry, the chevalier sans peur et sans reproche, a faultless commander, and a triple DSO. Now will you get the book?" "It seems to me you're sore need to read a little history," she said, smoothing a mitered sheet corner with a large admiring hand. "So I'll bring you the book when I come past. I'm going out to the pictures anyhow." It was nearly an hour before she reappeared, immense in a camel hair coat. The room lights had been put out, and she materialized into the light of his reading lamp like some kindly genie. "I was hoping you'd be asleep," she said. "I don't really think you should start on these tonight." "If there is anything that is likely to put me to sleep," he said, "it would be an English history book, so you can hold hands with a clear conscience." "I'm going with Nurse Burrows." "You can still hold hands." "I've no patience with you," she said patiently, and faded backwards into the gloom. She had brought two books. One was the kind of history book known as a historical reader. It bore the same relation to history as stories from the Bible bear to the Holy Writ. Canute rebuked his courtiers on the shore, Alfred burned the cakes, Raleigh spread his cloak for Elizabeth, Nelson took leave of Hardy in his cabin on the Victory, all in nice, clear, large print and one-sentence paragraphs. To each episode went one full-page illustration. There was something curiously touching in the fact that the Amazon should treasure this childish literature. He turned to the flyleaf to see if her name was there. On the flyleaf was written, "Ella Darrell, Form 3, Newbridge High School, Newbridge, Gloucestershire, England, Europe, the world, the universe." This was surrounded by a fine selection of colored transfers. Did all children do that, he wondered? write their names like that, and spend their time in class making transfers? He certainly had, and the sight of those squares of bright primitive color brought back his childhood as nothing had for many years. He had forgotten the excitement of transfers, that wonderfully satisfying moment when you began the peeling off and saw that it was coming perfectly. The adult world held few such gratifications. A clean, smacking drive at golf, perhaps, was the nearest, or the moment when your line tightened and you knew that the fish had struck. The little book pleased him so much that he went through it at his leisure, solemnly reading each childish story. This, after all, was the history that every adult remembered. This was what remained in their minds when tonnage and poundage and ship money and Laud's liturgy and the Rye House plot and the Triennial Acts and all the long muddle of schism and shindy, treaty and treason had faded from their consciousness. The Richard III story, when he came to it, was called The Princes in the Tower, and it seemed that young Ella had found the princes a poor substitute for Coeur de Lion, since she had filled every small O throughout the tale with neat pencil shading. The two golden-haired boys who played together in the sunbeam from the barred window in the accompanying picture had each been provided with a pair of anachronistic spectacles, and on the blank back of the picture page someone had been playing noughts and crosses. As far as young Ella was concerned, the princes were a dead loss. And yet it was a sufficiently arresting little story, macabre enough to delight any child's heart. The innocent children, the wicked uncle, the classic ingredients in a tale of classic simplicity. It had also a moral. It was the perfect cautionary tale. But the king won no profit from this wicked deed. The people of England were shocked by his cold-blooded cruelty and decided that they would no longer have him for king. They sent for a distant cousin of Richard's, Henry Tudor, who was living in France, to come and be crowned king in his stead. Richard died bravely in the battle which resulted, but he had made his name hated throughout the country, and many deserted him to fight for his rival. Well, it was neat, but not gaudy, reporting at its simplest. He turned to the second book. The second book was the school history proper. The 2,000 years of England's story were neatly parceled into compartments for ready reference. The compartments, as usual, were reigns. It was no wonder that one pinned a personality to a reign, forgetful that the personality had known and lived under other kings. One put them in pigeonholes automatically. Pepys, Charles II, Shakespeare, Elizabeth, Marlborough, Queen Anne. It never crossed one's mind that someone who had seen Queen Elizabeth could also have seen George I. One had been conditioned to the reign idea from childhood. However, it did simplify things when you were just a policeman with a game leg and a concussed spine hunting up some information on dead and gone royalties to keep yourself from going crazy. He was surprised to find the reign of Richard III so short. To have made oneself one of the best-known rulers in all those 2,000 years of England's history, and to have had only 2 years to do it in, surely augured a towering personality. If Richard had not made friends, he had certainly influenced people. The history book, too, thought he had personality. Richard was a man of great ability, but quite unscrupulous as to his means. He boldly claimed the crown on the absurd ground that his brother's marriage with Elizabeth Woodville had been illegal and the children of it illegitimate. He was accepted by the people, who dreaded a minority, and began his reign by making a progress through the South, where he was well received. During this progress, however, the 2 young princes who were living in the Tower disappeared and were believed to have been murdered. A serious rebellion followed, which Richard put down with great ferocity. In order to recover some of his lost popularity, he held a parliament, which passed useful statutes against benevolences, maintenance, and livery. But a second rebellion followed. This took the form of an invasion, with French troops, by the head of the Lancaster branch, Henry Tudor. He encountered Richard at Bosworth near Leicester, where the treachery of the Stanleys gave the day to Henry.
Richard was killed in the battle, fighting courageously, leaving behind him a name hardly less infamous than that of John. What on earth were benevolences, maintenance, and livery? And how did the English like having the succession decided for them by French troops? But of course, in the days of the Roses, France was still a sort of semi-detached part of England, a country much less foreign to an Englishman than Ireland was. A 15th century Englishman went to France as a matter of course, but to Ireland only under protest. He lay and thought about that England, the England over which the War of the Roses had been fought. A green, green England, with not a chimney stack from Cumberland to Cornwall. An England still unhedged with great forests alive with game, and wild marshes thick with wild fowl. An England with the same small group of dwellings repeated every few miles in endless permutation. Castle, church, and cottages, monastery, church, and cottages, manor, church, and cottages. The strips of cultivation round the cluster of dwellings, and beyond that, the greenness, the unbroken greenness, the deep-rutted lanes that ran from group to group, mired to bog in the winter and white with dust in the summer, decorated with wild roses or red with hawthorn as the seasons came and went. For 30 years over this green, uncrowded land, the Wars of the Roses had been fought. But it had been more of a blood feud than a war, a Montague and Capulet affair, of no great concern to the average Englishman. No one pushed in at your door to demand whether you were York or Lancaster, and to hail you off to a concentration camp if your answer proved to be the wrong one for the occasion. It was a small, concentrated war, almost a private party. They fought a battle in your lower meadow and turned your kitchen into a dressing station, and then moved off somewhere or other to fight a battle somewhere else. And a few weeks later you would hear what had happened at that battle, and you would have had a family row about the result, because your wife was probably Lancaster and you were perhaps York, and it was all rather like following rival football teams. No one persecuted you for being a Lancastrian or a Yorkist, any more than you would be persecuted for being an Arsenal fan or a Chelsea follower. He was still thinking of that green England when he fell asleep, and he was not a whit wiser about the 2 young princes and their fate. And that is where we are going to leave it for today. If you like what I do here, please hit that like button, subscribe, follow along, share me with all your friends, and otherwise, I'll be seeing you guys next time. Bye!